Having lived and worked all over the world, including across the African continent, on international health and development, I think it's very important that we think about how we use all the tools in the toolbox. And I have appreciated USCIRF's work on protecting all religious freedom and calling out countries, including my birth country of India, for issues around persecution of Christians and Muslims. But I think the central question here goes to Ms. Onabogu's point about weakness of government. I think that's the phrase you used, and I think it really is critical, because it's not that I don't agree with Mr. Perkins that we should address religious freedom. I do think we should. But I think at the core, when you look at this issue, it is the weakness of government that allows extremism of any religion to thrive. And so that's why I think that the way in which USAID has now been stripped and paused, all of the funding has been paused, 83% of funding for USAID has currently been stopped, is a problem, because many of those projects were actually trying to address the underlying root causes that I think perhaps there's some agreement on the panel that that we should be addressing. And so the New York Times recently reported a list of words and terms that the Trump administration has banned or restricted from government communications. And those included things like cultural differences, community diversity, discrimination, prejudice, victim, and even women. Makes it very hard to think about nuanced programs that address those underlying causes. And so, Ms. Onabogu, I want to ask you, how would banning projects that utilize those terms affect the U.S.'s ability to accurately describe and respond to violence in Nigeria?
So thank you for the question. Working in complex environments like Nigeria and elsewhere requires being able to take into account the total picture of occurrences in different parts of the country. The way we define issues as peace and violence may seem different in different communities and across different communities in Nigeria. So it would be it would be necessary to take into account the complexity and diversity of Nigeria towards trying to ensure we can devise sustainable solutions to addressing root causes of violence there.
In fact, I used diversity in my opening statement, but that, I guess, would tag it as a project that's not worthwhile. I want to specifically focus on a State Department project in northeastern Nigeria called Nigerian Youth Care. This program has been suspended by the Trump administration. It provided Nigerian youth with mentorship and training on how to bridge religious divides, and it launched initiatives that were meant to reduce hate speech and inflammatory rhetoric on social media. Could you explain, Ms. Onabogu, how programs that focus on interreligious dialogue can actually assist in reducing the occurrence of religious violence and extremism?
Thank you. As to point about youth making up 70% of the population in Nigeria is below the age of 35. And I think has been referenced by others on this panel too as well, the importance of engaging youth. I think in complex environments like Nigeria, where identities are formed around ethnicity or religion, and especially in communities where we have seen protracted conflicts that have taken on a different life of their own time after time. Again, as I mentioned, in the case of Plateau State, we've seen conflicts going on for over 20 years. It's important to bring voices together, to bring people together, to bring communities together, to be able to identify what the problems are and find ways to work through them together. So being able to push interreligious dialogue or interfaith dialogue, and some of them which I've witnessed on the ground, is a good example of work that could be done to bridge divides, bridge gaps in Nigeria. In fact, data actually shows that in Nigeria, as in some other countries too as well on the continent, but in Nigeria specifically, religious leaders actually are really trusted by their communities. And we've seen several examples of interfaith mediation efforts across Nigeria that have been really successful.
Well, that leads me to another project around good governance. The International Republican Institute formerly funded a project in Nigeria to educate political party leaders on good governance strategies and bringing traditionally politically marginalized groups in Nigeria, including women, young people, religious minorities, into the political process. That's another project that this administration has ended. What's the importance of representative democracy in Nigeria and the value of representation for traditionally marginalized groups, including religious minorities? I'll start with you, but I'm interested in your perspective on this as well, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you. So as I mentioned in my remarks, elections and political appointments are two important areas where we see the interplay between religion and politics, where we've seen time and time again that politicians romanticize Nigeria's unity, but basically when it comes to elections, they just use it to instigate and galvanize votes. As I mentioned, this year, 2025, is a critical year for elections in Nigeria. The chair of Nigeria's Independent National Election Commission, his term runs out in December of this year. If we go back to 2023 and we see how divisive those elections were, it's important to start laying the groundwork now to ensure that political actors are not in a position to utilize religion or utilize ethnicity to foment violence and to garner votes. We're already seeing examples of what's happening with the by-elections that happened in 2024. So it's really important to start as the country, as Nigeria starts thinking about sort of the makeup of the leadership, what the new leadership of Nigeria's Independent Election Commission could look like. This is an opportunity to start engaging and identifying key holders in the key stakeholders in the political space and in civil society as well, to work together towards ensuring that citizens that the faith of citizens is restored in the electoral process.
Thank you. And Mr. Perkins, as I said, I've utilized some of your work and USERV's work in other regions because I think it is important for us to be consistent in allowing for all religious freedom, not just for some. And so your views on how religious freedom and governance, good governance and democracy interact, and why it's important to ensure that we really are protecting, and in a place like Nigeria where you have a very divided population religiously, and you need to pay attention to all religious freedom. How would you speak to the importance of that?
Well, thank you for that question, and I appreciate your interest in this, and you've correctly analyzed it. I did a lot of interfaith work in the Middle East, sitting down with imams, sitting down with evangelicals in places where they were a very extreme minority. Here in Nigeria, it's a pretty much divided country equally. I think it goes back to what has been identified here is the governance of the country and the will of the current administration. Now, we could point to a lot of programs. I bet if you and I sit down and had a cup of coffee, we would identify probably a number of programs that we would agree with. Probably wouldn't agree on everything, but we would agree on some things. We've been doing those programs for decades in Nigeria, and we've not seen the positive outcomes. And so when we move to see the State Department designate in 2020 this country as a country of particular concern, it was to get the attention of the government of the country so that we might get them to be willfully engaged like we've seen in other countries. So I think this is really not a question about are some of these projects viable and should they be in place. I think we would all agree that yes, there are some.
Well, not everyone agrees, unfortunately. I mean, 83% of these projects have been cut. And
I understand that.
The question is, do you take a hatchet to something or do you take a scalpel to something?
Well, I think we're in a situation where we've got to do something different because the outcomes have not changed. And I think taking this approach, as we're focused on today, declaring this designation as a country of particular concern, hopefully would get the government's attention so that we can have this collaboration to address the underlying issues that has allowed religion to be utilized as a weapon of division.
Well, I agree with you that religion is utilized as a weapon too often, and there are extremists in all religions. I've seen that, my birth country of India I'm proud that we've had so many religions living side by side, and my home state of Kerala is the place where we have the most Christians in the country, and so I understand the importance of that. But I again go back to your very important point about all of the pieces that are essential here. And I hope that as we continue this dialogue, we think about what it does when you just destroy everything all at once. The hole that is left in the countries that we have been providing critical aid to is enormous. And we know that extremists go to fill any hole that is there. And so I would just argue that actually it's a very important part of how the United States should be engaging with Nigeria and with countries around the world to not eliminate and create huge holes in humanitarian assistance and in governance and democracy projects and all of these things, because when you do, you are creating another opportunity for chaos to be exploited. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.